invite you to join me in Exodus chapter 3 this morning. Exodus chapter 3. As you're turning there, I want you to think about something really positive as we're coming into this moment. And here it is. Do you have any regrets? Yeah, right? We all have regrets. We all have things that we wish, if it were possible, we could get into a time machine. We can go back and we could redo something that we did earlier or didn't do earlier in our life. We live with regrets, and you have regrets, and I have regrets. I regret doing so many squats on Friday because these steps were really hard today. I regret not asking permission on some things as a kid. I regret not practicing properly for a performance that I had, musically speaking, several years ago. You know, and we could go on and on. We all could have them. We all have them. We could all share them, and we'd be here till next week because we seem to live in this state of regret. And while there are some years that I wish I could go back and relive, there's a whole lot that I wish I don't want to. And I think you would be the same. Because these regrets, they stick with us. These regrets, they tend to be opportunities for the devil to work in your life in a negative way. Because we begin to look back over the course of time at all the things that we regret or the choices that we wish we could change. And sometimes we begin to think that because of those things, that now somehow God's grace is unavailable to me. There are those who would say, you know, I've done too much in my life. God couldn't save me. I've done too much. You may have somebody in your family like that. You may be here this morning and that's what you think. But I want you to understand and realize, and I hope that you would come to believe, as I'm sure many in the room have already, that there's no sin too great that God can't forgive. It doesn't matter how many sins you've stacked up in your life. When you come to God by faith in what Jesus did, salvation is available to all who would come by faith. But sometimes, even if we get over that, we'll begin to say, yes, you know, I accept that salvation is an option. I believe that God can forgive me because of what Jesus did. I believe that Jesus was sufficient for what was needed in my heart and my life. I accept that. And we may even choose to believe, you know, I can follow Jesus. I saw how bad Peter did it, so I'm sure that I can follow Jesus too. Yes, I believe that Jesus can save me. I believe that I can follow Jesus. And you might even say, you know, I believe I can grow in my understanding of Jesus. I can grow, I can study, I can learn, and I can grow. But what seems to elude many of us is an understanding that you can serve God in spite of your past. Because while somehow we know that it's forgiven, we know that it's gone, we are learning God's word, we're doing what God wants, somehow in the back of our mind, and I truly believe it's the devil that speaks to us, in the back of our minds, there's still that nagging thought that tells us, I can't serve God because of what I've done in my past. I want us to look at that today. Because when God calls us, what are we going to say? When God says, I need you to do this, oftentimes what we say is much of what Moses said. Ultimately ends up being, no, I can't. And we have a variety of reasons why we can't do that. Why do we think that our past can be overcome in salvation and fellowship and growth, but our past can't be overcome in order to serve God. For some reason, we think that we can't serve God, when in reality, as we're going to find out in Moses, our excuses that we use, listen, our excuses that we use are nothing more than guilt, fear, or shame of the past regrets rising up in your life. That's what excuses tend to be. We look back and we think, well, because of what I chose to do here, I can't serve God. Well, because of what I did here, I can't serve God. There are a host of characters in the Scriptures that consistently did dumb things, and God still called them for use, and still called them to service. Moses is an example of that. So when God comes calling, as he's going to come calling to Moses, are you going to jump after the chance? Are you going to jump in spite of your past? Or are you going to do what Moses did and try to offer up all these excuses, when the underlying problem is really fear? So Moses is tending the sheep. He goes up to find some sheep, and he rounds the corner, and what's he find? He finds a bush on fire, and he steps back, and he realizes this bush is on fire, and he doesn't want to get in the middle of that. And then he takes a little closer look, and he realizes this bush is on fire, but it is not being consumed. Now that's an odd thing. This is weird. This is strange. I don't know what to make of this. So Moses thought in chapter 3, verse 3, I must go over and look at this remarkable sight. Why isn't the bush burning up? When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called out to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. Now I don't know about you, but I probably would have lost it right there. Anybody with me? I mean, I think I just would have lost it at that time. And maybe he was frozen in fear and couldn't move, and God was able to speak more. But I don't know how I would have reacted, but that would have been a really strange occurrence, don't you think? To walk up on a bush that's not being consumed and have a voice come at you out of that. I mean, that is weird. And yet Moses says, here I am. Now, I guess he's braver than I was. Here I am, he answered. Do not come closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. And he continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. It was understood to look and to see God meant certain death. And out of respect, he wanted to hide his face. Out of preservation of life, he wanted to hide his face. So God creates this wonderful moment in order to get Moses' attention. Have you ever thought about the wonderful moments God uses to get your attention? God may have used a family crisis. Maybe he used a personal crisis. Maybe God used a natural occurrence to get your attention, maybe like this. Maybe God has used a complication at work to get your attention. Maybe he's caused financial problems, health concerns, devastations, whatever. Think about how has God tried to get your attention. And some of you, I know, would be like me, and you would look back across your life, and only now when you look back would you go, oh, was that what he was doing? Because sometimes when we're in the middle of it, all we go into is crisis mode. We go into crisis management. I have to fix this. I have to fix this. I got to do this. We got to line this up. We have to do this. And we get into crisis management mode, and we're trying to handle the situation, when all the while it may be simply that God's trying to get our attention. We don't always see it that way. Maybe we should be looking at life from that view. This is bad. God, how are you trying to get my attention? This is awesome. God, how are you trying to get my attention? See, often I think we are so self-absorbed that all we see is how it affects me. We don't necessarily step back and say, God, what are you trying to say in this particular moment? We either look at the benefits that we're getting from this situation, or we look at the problems that we're facing, and we get into a self-seeking mode. When all the while, I think God would love to have us begin to ask the questions, what are you trying to say? What are you trying to show me? What do you want me to learn? What are you asking me to do? Because if you put the fleece out, expect a response. I felt that the Lord was calling me to preach. Last thing in the world I cared to do. Wasn't on my mind. Well, it was on my mind in a very negative way. I didn't want to do it. Wasn't going to do it. And so I put the fleece out. Well, God, hey, if this is what you want me to do, well, you need to do this. And so he did. And it was difficult and it was hard. But if you put the fleece out, expect a response. So God comes to Moses and he says, look, I have heard, I have seen the oppression, the suffering, the cries of my people, and I choose you. I've come all this way, I've come down, I've set this bush on fire, it's not consuming itself, you've taken your sandals off, I'm speaking to you, guess what? I choose you. And then Moses in the back of his mind said, you made a bad choice. Now we nervously laugh because we're like, well, God's perfect. How could he make a bad? But we think this, don't we? Well, God, how could I ever do that? How could I lead that discussion? How could I teach that class? How could I serve in that role? God, how could I ever do that? And we do just like Moses. We think, we may not say it, and somehow we think we're exonerated from the thought because we didn't say it. God, you got this all wrong. You've got it all wrong. And so Moses begins to share his concerns. Who am I, verse 11, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? You see, God wanted Moses to do this. He saw the problem. God had compassion. He wanted to do something about it, and he chose Moses to go fix it. All for that, Moses is simply saying, look, who am I to go do this? First of 5 different excuses that he's giving God. Who am I to do this? He had a confidence problem. How many of us have confidence problems? We say, God, I can't. God, I couldn't do that. I'm unqualified. I'm unskilled. I'm untrained to do what it is you want me to do. And ultimately, this is what Moses is saying. Who am I to go do this? Now, don't forget. He gives 5 excuses, but there's really one motivation. 5 excuses, one underlying motivation. And it was fear. It was fear. We're going to find out in a minute, so I'll just go ahead and spoiler alert. Moses was afraid because if you recall, he left Egypt because he'd killed an Egyptian and Pharaoh wanted him dead. Now don't forget that Pharaoh is basically an adoptive relative to him. And so Pharaoh wants him dead. And he flees, and he's been gone all this time, living in fear. Moses made a bad decision. Moses had an emotional moment. Moses failed dramatically, and he flees out of fear. And now he has lived in fear for 40 years of getting found out. And now God is saying, look, I've heard about the problems going on. I've seen the suffering, and now I want you to go back to Egypt. And this whole beginning, who am I? I can't do that. It's all rooted out of his fear based upon his past. And I contend with you today that most of the excuses we use when God calls are out of a sense of fear of our past being discovered, fear of our past being unearthed, fear of who we used to be finding its way on social media today. And we're scared. So who am I? And he's got this confidence issue. And he goes, and in verse 13, Moses asked God, well, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? What am I supposed to say, God? Because at each time, God's giving him the answer. God's answering every excuse. Don't you just hate it when God does that? Well, God, I can't do that. And then somebody lovingly and kindly and spiritually comes up and goes, yes, you can. Oh, I can't serve on that committee. Because I know they're calling you right now. Oh, no, I can't. No, I couldn't do that. And God's like, in the back of your mind going, why not? Sure you can. Oh, I could never give 10% of my money because I just can't afford to do that. And God's like, well, it's all mine anyway. I'm just asking for 10%. You get to keep 90. We live in, God, I just can't. And he answers every excuse, and God's going to do it now because the underlying problem is simply fear. We fear that we're going to mess up. We fear that we're going to say the wrong thing. We fear that we can't actually go through with it. We fear this sense of rejection. We fear this sense of failure. And all these fears are coming out of our mouth or out of our prayer life with God in these forms of excuses. Well, who am I? What am I going to say? I mean, if they ask me a question and I don't have the answers. Let me just help you right now. If somebody were to ask you a question, I mean, a deep question, that's the main reason we don't talk about God, Bible, scriptures with anybody, isn't it? Because we're afraid that somebody's going to ask me a question that I don't have an answer to. Let me help you. This is free. This isn't in my notes. Somebody asks you a question that you don't have an answer to. Let me help you. It's really simple. You can repeat after me. I don't know. Well, how's that going to make me look? Human. I don't know the answer to that question. I will do my best to find it. And that's usually when I start getting texts blowing up on my phone. Hey, preacher man, this dude asked me this question. That's fun. I don't know. It's okay. But he says, what am I going to say? And God answers him. This is a knowledge issue. We're afraid. We fear that, well, what if I don't have the knowledge? You go down to chapter 4. And well, what if they don't believe me? What proof do I have? And that's when we get the staff throwing it on the ground. Then Moses, in verse 10 of chapter 4, well, I've never been eloquent of speech, either in the past or recently, or since you've even been speaking to your servant. Because my mouth and my tongue, they're sluggish. I can't speak. I don't have the ability to do what you're asking me to do. Consequently, if you go on and read the story of Moses, count up the number of times that Aaron actually speaks and how many times Moses actually goes ahead and speaks. It's humorous to me because he's sitting here telling God, no, I can't speak. I can't handle that. My mouth and my tongue, they get all messed up. They're off rhythm. They're off time. And I stutter, and it's like I just can't handle that. And yet, when they stand up before Pharaoh, he's the one who does all the speaking. Because, see, the excuse was just an excuse. The underlying root cause was the fear involved. Well, then finally, Moses says, and this is when the Lord gets upset with him, please, Lord, send somebody else. Well, at each turn, God solves every issue Moses has. Moses is gonna go. And so we get in here. And Moses agrees to go. In verse 18 of chapter 4, Moses went back to his father-in-law Jethro and said to him, please let me return to my relatives in Egypt and see if they are still living. Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. Now in Midian, the Lord told Moses, he's off the mountain, he's in Midian. The Lord told Moses, return to Egypt, for all the men who wanted to kill you are dead. Talk about burying the lead. I mean, I'm sure if it were me and then Moses, I'm sure he didn't say this, but he may have thought it. You could have started with that. We wouldn't have had to have gone through 2 chapters wasting time. If you'd have just started with, hey, the ones who want to kill you are dead, will you now go? You know why God didn't do that? Because then Moses would have gone in his strength and not by faith in his God. And if God removes all of your fears before he asks you the questions, then you go in your strength, not in his. But when you respond positively and you say, God, I'm not sure I'm equipped, I'm not sure I'm able, I'm not sure I'm qualified, I'm not sure I'm skilled, and I've got some stuff, I've got some baggage in my closet that I don't want to unearth. But if you say that I need to do it, yes, Lord, I'll do it. See, that's by faith. That's you coming before God, and God says, I need you to do this, and you say, yes, I'll jump. I'll jump. That's faith. That's what God's looking for. He's looking for his people to respond to him in faith rather than by fear. And if all of our fears are removed, then it's not a faith issue anymore. We need to be responding to God by faith. God, I don't understand, but I'll say yes. God, I'm not sure, but I'll say yes. God, I don't think I can, but I'll say yes. God, I've got all this, but I'll say yes. God, I say yes to you. And look what happens. In this particular instance, God told Moses, by the way, the ones who wanted you dead are gone. See, so the question comes, was Moses really dealing with real problems or simply an unhealthy fear of his past coming back up? Maybe he stuttered. It sure sounded like he was stating a truth and stating a fact. But don't let your problems be considered more than the power of God. Because if God's calling you to something, he already understands all about you. He knows everything about you. So what do we learn here? What do we learn? Well, we have oftentimes 4 ways that we respond to God. And maybe one of these ways is a way that you have responded to God. God has asked you to do something. God may ask you to tithe. God may ask you to share the gospel with your neighbor. God may ask you to move deeper in relationship with him and move from just worship attendance to Sunday school attendance. God may have asked you to teach a class. God may have asked you to lead a group. God may have asked you to serve on a committee. God may have asked you, and will be asking you, to move deeper in a relationship and move deeper with him in a discipleship group. God may be asking you to go out on a mission trip for him. God may be asking you to serve on the mission mission field, to serve in a ministry capacity. God may be calling you to ministry. God may be calling you to anything. And you typically, if you're like the rest of us, respond in one of four ways initially. The first one is, well, I couldn't do that. I couldn't. How could I? And this is where we said, I just couldn't do that. And we have all these reasons in our minds about why we couldn't do that. Just like Moses. Moses was like, well, I couldn't do that. You know, my tongue and my mouth and you know, I don't think I can do that. I don't know what to say. I'm not sure about all these other things. I couldn't do that. And then maybe another option is, well, I shouldn't do that. I really shouldn't do that. You know, because God, man, I really messed up in my past. And, you know, I thank you for my salvation. I thank you for forgiving me. I thank you that my sin is as far as the east is from the west. I just can't get everybody else in church to let my sin be as far as the east is from the west. Oops. See, we do that sometimes, don't we, in church? God's forgiven them, but we don't. So sometimes we respond to God's call like, well, I shouldn't do that because, you know, this group of people over here, they know me. You know, and Jesus even said a prophet's not without honor except in his own town. And so, you know, I just couldn't do that. Church, hear me. If God calls, we all need to say, yes, Lord, yes. We all need to be saying yes. We all need to be encouraging one another. Say yes to God. Because we don't know. We don't know. We know the person and we're like, well, I don't know. And so we've already caused them to say, I don't think I should serve God in this way. But if God's calling, so then sometimes we respond, well, I can't. I can't afford to do that, God. I can't afford the reputation hit. I can't afford my social hit. I can't afford the financial hit. I can't afford, I'm too busy. I can't do that. I'm too busy, God. You know, I've got all these other things going on. God, hey, I'm doing a lot of good things over here for you. Why don't you just focus on this? You see, and God's like, well, I want you to do that. And see, that's where I was at that moment when God began to say, I want you to preach. I want you to be a pastor. I want you to go in the ministry. I'm like, no, wait a minute. No, because I'll do all these things over here for you. I'll do all these things right here. You see, it was an excuse based out of fear. And the fear was, A, that I would be like my dad who was asked to leave 4 different churches, or I would be, B, broke like my family was, because preachers tend to get that way. I was afraid, and it was a fear because I was going to be an anesthesiologist, and man, they make the money. Have you had surgery and had to pay that bill recently? They make good money. And if I didn't do that, I was going to be a neurologist, and you know they made good money too. See, it was all about the money. I was in the 80s, man. Everything's about the money. It was all about the money. And this is like, no, God. Hey, and you know what? I'll give 15% in my tithe. God, I'll go on mission trips. God, I'll take this over here, and I'll do all this, and I'll teach, and I'll do that. I'll do all these things. And God's like, that's not what I'm asking. Exchange what you think is good for what I know to be better. And that's the question at hand. God's asking you to exchange the good for what he knows to be better. Is he calling you? And you're saying, oh, I can't do that because of all this other stuff. And God's like, yeah, I could remove all that. Or sometimes we might even say, I won't. Do you notice out of the 5 excuses, which one got the anger of God raised? It's the I won't do it. I won't do it. Sometimes we respond that way. God, I won't. I won't do that. How is it that you are responding to God today? Because if God's calling you to move deeper in relationship, to say, well, I want you to move. I want you to be in Sunday school. I want you to tithe. I want you to go on a mission trip. I want you to lead out in this class. I want you to go deeper with me in a regular Bible study moment. I want you to go move further with me. How are you responding? God may be calling you into the ministry. How are you responding? God may be calling you to the mission field. How are you responding? God may be calling you to be a member of this church. How are you responding? God may be saying, you gave me your heart, now I need you to follow that with baptism. How are you responding? I couldn't, I shouldn't, I can't, I won't. Or would you today simply say, yes, Lord. Yes, Lord. I'll go.